So in this video, we're going to go over how to write a good argument for an argumentative essay. Many of your college assignments will ask you to read and write arguments about debatable issues. The questions being debated might be matters of public policy. Should corporations be allowed to advertise on public school property? Or they might be scholarly issues. What roles do genes play in determining behavior? On such questions, reasonable people may disagree. As you read arguments across the discipline and enter into academic or public policy debates, pay attention to the questions being asked, the evidence being presented, and the various positions being argued. You'll find the critical reading strategies, previewing, annotating, and conversing with texts to be useful as you ask questions about an argument's logic, evidence, and use of appeals. When you evaluate an argument, look closely at the evidence behind it. Some unreasonable argumentative tactics are known as logical fallacies or errors in logic. Most of the fallacies, such as hasty generalizations and false analogies, are misguided or dishonest uses of legitimate argumentative strategies. The examples in this section suggest when such strategies are reasonable and when they are not. Generalizing, inductive reasoning. Writers and thinkers generalize all the time. We look at a sample of data and we conclude that data we have not observed will most likely conform to what we have seen. From a spoonful of soup, we conclude just how salty the whole bowl will be. When we draw a conclusion from an array of facts, we are engaged in inductive reasoning. Some reasoning deals in probability, not certainty. For a conclusion to be highly probable, it must be based on evidence that is sufficient, representative, and relevant. The fallacy known as hasty generalization is a conclusion based on insufficient or unrepresentative evidence. In a single year, scores on standardized tests in California's public schools rose by 10 points. Therefore, more children than ever are succeeding in America's public school systems. Data from one state do not justify a conclusion about the whole United States. A stereotype is a hasty generalization about a group. Here are a few examples. Stereotypes. Women are bad bosses. Politicians are corrupt. Children are always curious. Stereotyping is common because of our human tendency to perceive selectively. We tend to see what we want to see. We notice evidence confirming our already formed opinions and fail to notice evidence to the contrary. For example, if you have concluded that politicians are corrupt, your stereotype will be confirmed by news reports of legislators being indicted. Even though every day the media describe public officials serving their communities honestly and well. Drawing analogies. An analogy points out a similarity between two things that are otherwise different. Analogies can be an effective means of arguing a point. It is not always easy to draw the line between a reasonable and an unreasonable analogy. At times, however, an analogy is clearly off base, in which case it is called a false analogy. False analogy. If we can send a spaceship to Mars, we should be able to find a cure for the common cold. The writer has falsely assumed that because two things are alike in one respect, they must be alike in others. Exploring the solar system and finding a cure for the common cold are both scientific challenges, but the problems confronting medical researchers are quite different from those solved by space scientists. Tracing causes and effects. Demonstrating a connection between causes and effect is rarely simple. For example, to explain why a chemistry class has a high failure rate, you would begin by listing possible causes: inadequate preparation of students, poor teaching, lack of qualified tutors, and so on. Next, you would investigate each possible cause. Only after investigating possible causes would you be able to weigh the impact of each cause and suggest appropriate remedies. Because cause Cause and effect reasoning is complex. It is not surprising that writers oversimplify it. In particular, writers sometimes assume that because one event follows another, the first is the cause of the second. This common fallacy is known as post hoc fallacy, meaning after this, therefore because of this. So here's an example of post hoc fallacy. Since Governor Cho took office, unemployment of minorities in the state has decreased by 7%. Governor Cho should be applauded for reducing unemployment among minorities. Is the governor solely responsible for the decrease? Are there other reasons? The writer must show that Governor Cho's policies are responsible for the decrease in unemployment. It is not enough to show that the decrease followed the governor's taking office. In other words, when you make a claim, you have got to show evidence to show that how did unemployment decrease by 7%. And if you don't show evidence, then you have a fallacy. It doesn't matter if it's a post hoc or not. All fallacies occur when a writer makes a claim and does not back it up with suitable evidence. Weighing options, especially when reasoning about problems and solutions, writers must weigh options. To be fair, a writer should mention the full range of options, showing why one is superior to the other or might work well in combination with others. It is unfair to suggest that only two alternatives exist, when in fact there are more. Writers who set up a false choice between their preferred option and one that is clearly unsatisfactory present faulty either-or logic. And so either-or fallacy. Our current war against drugs has not worked. Either we should legalize drugs, or we should turn the drug war over to our armed forces and let them fight it. Are these the only solutions, legalizing drugs and calling out the army? Other options, such as funding for drug abuse prevention programs, for instance, are possible. So if you only list two options to solve a problem, but there actually are many other options, then you are listing, it's also known as a false dilemma fallacy. It's not just either or fallacy, but it's also a false dilemma fallacy. Making assumptions. An assumption is a claim that is taken to be true without the need of proof. Most arguments are based to some extent on assumptions, since writers rarely have the time and space to prove all the conceivable claims on which an argument is based. For example, someone arguing about the best means of limiting population growth in developing countries might assume that the goal of limiting population growth is worthwhile. For most audiences, there would be no need to articulate this assumption or to defend it. There is a danger, however, in failing to spell out and prove a claim that is clearly controversial. Consider the following short argument in which a key claim is missing. Violent crime is increasing. Therefore, we should vigorously enforce the death penalty. The writer seems to be assuming both that the death penalty deters violent criminals and that it is a fair punishment, and that most audiences would agree. These are not reasonable assumptions. The writer will need to state and support both claims. When a missing claim is an assertion that few would agree with, we say that a writer is guilty of a non sequitur fallacy. Christopher gets plenty of sleep. Therefore, he will be a successful student in the university's pre-med program. Does it take more than sleep to be a successful college student? The missing claim that people with good sleep habits always make successful students would be hard to prove. Deductive reasoning. When we deduce a conclusion, we put things together like any good detective. We establish that a general principle is true, that a specific case is an example of that principle, and therefore a particular conclusion about that case is a certainty. Deductive reasoning can often be structured in a three-step argument called a syllogism. The three steps are the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. Anything that increases radiation in the environment is dangerous to public health. Major premise. Nuclear reactors increase radiation in the environment. minor premise. Therefore, nuclear reactors are dangerous to public health. Conclusion. So the major premise is a generalization. The minor premise is a specific case. The conclusion follows from applying the generalization to the specific case. Deductive arguments break down if one of the premises is not true, or if the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. In the following brief argument, the major premise is very likely untrue. The police do not give speeding tickets to people driving less than 5 miles an hour over the limit. Dominic is driving 59 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone. Therefore, the police will not give Dominic a speeding ticket. The conclusion is true only if the premise is true. If the police sometimes give tickets for driving less than 5 miles an hour over the limit, Dominic cannot safely conclude that he will avoid a ticket. In the following argument, both premises might be true, but the conclusion does not follow logically from them. All the members of our club ran in this year's Boston Marathon. Jay ran in this year's Boston Marathon, therefore Jay is a member of our club. The fact that Jay ran in the race is no guarantee that he is a member of the club. Presumably many runners are non-members. Assuming that both premises are true, the following argument holds up. Though inductive reasoning leads to probable and not absolute truth, you can assess a conclusion's likely probability by asking 3 questions. This chart shows how to apply those questions to a sample conclusion based on a survey. The majority of students on our campus would volunteer at least 5 hours a week in a community organization if the school provided a placement service for volunteers. In a recent survey, 723 of 1,215 students said they would volunteer at least 5 hours a week in a community organization if the school provided a placement service for volunteers. Is the evidence sufficient? That depends. On a small campus, say 3,000 students, the pool of students surveyed would be sufficient for market research. But on a large campus, say 30,000, 1,215 students are only 4% of the population. If those 4% were known to be truly representative of the other 96%, however, even such a small sample would be sufficient. Is the evidence representative? The evidence is representative if those responding to the survey reflect the characteristics of the entire student population: age, gender, race, field of study, overall number of extracurricular commitments, and so on. If most of those surveyed are majors in a field like social work, the researchers should question the survey's conclusion. Is the evidence relevant? Yes. The results are directly linked to the conclusion. A survey about the number of hours students work for pay, by contrast, would not be relevant because it would not be about choosing to volunteer. Academic English. Many hasty generalizations contain words such as all, ever, always, and never, when qualifiers such as most, many, usually, and seldom would be more accurate. Distinguish between legitimate and unfair emotional appeals. There is nothing wrong with appealing to readers' emotions. After all, many issues worth arguing about have an emotional appeal, after all, many issues worth arguing about have an emotional as well as a logical dimension. Even the Greek logician Aristotle lists pathos, emotion, as a legitimate argumentative tactic. Emotional appeals are frequently misused. Many of the arguments we see in the media, for instance, strive to win our sympathy rather than our intelligent agreement. A TV commercial suggesting that you will be thin and attractive if you drink a certain beverage It's making a pitch to emotions. So is a political speech that recommends electing a candidate because he is a devoted husband, father, and volunteer firefighter. Words with strong or positive connotations, such as progressive and tree hugger, are examples of biased language, attacking the people who hold a belief rather than refuting their argument is called ad hominem. Associating a prestigious name like Western Trust with the writer's side is called a transfer fallacy. Claiming that an idea should be accepted because a large number of people are in favor of it is called a bandwagon appeal fallacy. Bringing in irrelevant issues is a red herring fallacy, named after a trick used in fox hunts to mislead the dogs by dragging a smelly fish across the trail. Don't buy this jacket. This season, share some values. Learn more about our Common Threads initiative and take the pledge to reduce consumption. Advertising makes use of ethical, logical, and emotional appeals to persuade consumers to buy a product or embrace a brand. This Patagonia ad makes an ethical appeal with its copy that invites customers to rethink their purchasing practices. Evaluating ethical, logical, and emotional appeal. Ancient Greek rhetoricians distinguished among three kinds of appeals used to influence readers: ethical, logical, and emotional. As you evaluate arguments, identify these appeals and question their effectiveness. Are they appropriate for the audience and the argument? Are they balanced and legitimate, or lopsided and misleading? Ethical appeals, ethos. Ethical arguments, also known as credibility arguments, call upon the writer's character, knowledge, and authority. Ask questions such as the following when you evaluate the ethical appeal of an argument. Is the writer trustworthy? Is the writer fair-minded and unbiased? Does the writer use sources knowledgeably? How does the writer describe the views of others? Logos. Reasonable arguments appeal to a reader's sense of logic, rely on evidence, and use inductive and deductive reasoning. Ask questions such as the following to evaluate the logical appeal of an argument. Is the evidence sufficient, representative, and relevant? Is the reasoning sound? Does the argument contain any logical fallacies? Are there any missing or mistaken premises? Emotional appeals, pathos. Emotional appeals appeal to a reader's beliefs and values. Ask questions such as the following to evaluate the emotional appeal of an argument. What values or beliefs does the writer address, either directly or indirectly? Are the emotional appeals legitimate and fair? Does the writer oversimplify or dramatize an issue? Do the emotional arguments highlight or shift attention away from the evidence? And so in order to have a valid argument, you have to have ethos, pathos, and logos. And if any one of those is missing or misused, then you end up with a fallacy. And you don't want fallacies in your paper. Judge how fairly a writer handles opposing views. The way in which a writer deals with opposing views is telling. Some writers address the arguments of the opposition fairly, conceding points when necessary and countering others, all in a civil spirit. Other writers will do almost anything to win an argument, either ignoring opposing views altogether or misrepresenting such views and attacking their proponents. Writers build credibility, ethos, by addressing opposing arguments fairly. As you read assignments, assess the credibility of your sources by looking at how they deal with views, not in agreement with their own. Some writers and speakers deliberately misrepresent the views of others. One way they do this is by setting up a straw man, a character so weak that he is easily knocked down. The straw man fallacy consists of an oversimplification or outright distortion of opposing views. For example, in a California debate over attempts to control the mountain lion population, pro-lion groups characterize their opponents as trophy hunters bent on shooting harmless lions. In truth, hunters were only one faction of those who saw a need to control the lion population. During the District of Columbia's struggle for voting representative, some representative set up a straw man shown in the following example. Washington, D.C. residents are lobbying for statehood, giving a city such as the District of Columbia the status of a state would be unfair. The straw man wanted statehood. In fact, most district citizens lobbied for voting representation in any form, not necessarily statehood. Writers often quote the words of writers who hold opposing views. In general, this is a good idea, for it assures some level of fairness and accuracy. At times, though, both the fairness and accuracy are an illusion. A source may be misrepresented when it is quoted out of context. All quotations are to some extent taken out of context, but a fair writer will explain the context to readers. To select a provocative sentence from a source and to ignore the more moderate sentences surrounding it is both unfair and misleading. Sometimes a writer deliberately distorts a source with ellipsis dots, which tell readers that words have been omitted from the original source. When those words are crucial to an author's meaning, omitting them is obviously unfair. Writing arguments. Evaluating the arguments of other writers prepares you to construct your own. When you ask questions about the logic and evidence of the arguments you read, you become more aware of such needs in your own writing. And when you pose objections to arguments, you more readily anticipate and counter objections to your own arguments. In constructing an argument, you take a stand on a debatable issue. Your purpose is to explain your understanding of the truth about a subject or to propose the best solution to a problem, reasonably and logically, without being combative. Your aim is to persuade your readers to reconsider their positions by offering new reasons to question existing viewpoints. It is best to start by informing yourself about the debate or conversation around a subject, sometimes called its context. If you are planning to write about the subject of offshore drilling, you might want to read sources that shed light on the social context, the concerns of consumers, the ideas of lawmakers, the proposals of environmentalists, and sources that may inform you about the intellectual context or scientific or theoretical responses by geologists, oceanographers, or economists in which the debate is played out. Because your readers may be aware of the social and intellectual context in which your issue is grounded, you will be at a disadvantage if you are not informed. Conduct some research before preparing your argument. Reading even a few sources will deepen your understanding of the conversation around the issue. Academic audiences in the United States will expect your writing to be assertive and confident, neither aggressive nor passive. You can create an assertive tone by acknowledging different positions and supporting your ideas with specific evidence. Too aggressive. Of course, only registered organ donors should be eligible for organ transplants. It's selfish and short-sighted to think otherwise. Too aggressive. Now this one is too passive. Well, I might be wrong, but I think that maybe people should have to register as organ donors if they want to be considered for a transplant. Assertive. If only registered organ donors are eligible for transplants, more people will register as donors. If you are uncertain about the tone of your work, ask for help at your school's writing center. View your audience as a panel of jurors. Do not assume that your audience agrees with you. Instead, envision skeptical readers who, like a panel of jurors, will make up their mind after listening to all sides of the argument. If you are arguing a public policy issue, you may want to aim your paper at readers who represent a variety of positions and find common ground among them. In the case of the debate over offshore drilling, for example, imagine a jury that represents those who have a stake in the matter, such as consumers, policymakers, and environmentalists. At times, you can deliberately narrow your audience if you are working within a word limit. For example, you might not have the space in which to address the concerns of all interested parties, or you might be interested in reaching one segment of a general audience, such as consumers. Once you identify your audience, it's helpful to think about what kinds of arguments will appeal to that audience. Using ethical, logical, and emotional appeals as a writer. To construct a convincing argument, you must establish your credibility, ethos, and appeal to your readers' sense of logic and reason, logos, as well as to their values and beliefs, pathos. So ethical appeals, ethos. To accept your argument, a reader must see you as trustworthy, fair, and reasonable. When you acknowledge alternative positions, you build common ground with readers and gain their trust by showing that you are knowledgeable. And when you use sources responsibly and respectfully, you inspire readers' confidence in your judgment. Logos. To persuade readers, you need to appeal to their sense of logic and sound reasoning. When you provide evidence, you offer readers logical support for your argument. And when you clarify underlying assumptions and avoid logical fallacies, you appeal to readers' desire for reason. Emotional appeals, pathos. To establish common ground with readers, you need to appeal to their beliefs and values as well as to their minds. When you offer vivid examples, surprising statistics, or compelling visuals, you engage readers in your argument. And when you balance emotional appeals with logical appeals, you highlight the human dimension of an issue to show readers why they should care about your argument. And so when you are constructing an argument, make sure your introduction includes a thesis statement that establishes your position on the issue you have chosen to debate. In the sentences leading up to this thesis, establish your credibility, ethos with readers by showing that you are knowledgeable and fair-minded. If possible, build common ground with readers who may not at first agree with your views and show them why they should consider your thesis. Draft a thesis statement for an argument. Identify the various positions in the debate you're writing about. At the heart of a good argument are debate and disagreement. An argumentative thesis takes a clear position on a debatable issue and is supported by evidence. Identify the points in the debate on which there is disagreement. Review any notes you have taken. Pose a question that has not been dealt with sufficiently. Write your thesis as an answer to your research question. Test your thesis. Is your position clear? Is your position debatable? The answers to both your questions should be yes. Revise your thesis. Why does your position matter? Put your working thesis to the so what test. Consider adding a because clause to your thesis. I always tell students to have topic, opinion, reasons. And I always have students include a because clause to my thesis. Back up your thesis with persuasive lines of argument. Arguments of any complexity contain lines of argument that, when taken together, might reasonably persuade readers that the thesis has merit. The following, for example, are the main lines of argument that Sam Jacobs used in his paper. Support your claims with specific evidence. You will need to support your central claim thesis and any subordinate claims with evidence, facts, statistics, examples, visuals, expert opinions, and so on. Debatable topics require that you consult sources to establish your ethos and to persuade your audience. As you read through or view the sources, you will learn more about the arguments and counter-arguments at the center of your debate. Using facts and statistics. A fact is something that is known with certainty because it has been objectively verified. Most arguments are supported, at least to some extent, by statistics. Writers use statistics to bolster their own position. If you suspect that a writer's handling of statistics is not fair, track down the original sources for those statistics or read authors with opposing views who may give you a fuller understanding of the numbers. Using examples and illustrations. Examples by illustrations rarely prove a point by themselves, but when used in combination with other forms of evidence, they flesh out an argument with details and bring it to life. So visuals can support your argument by providing vivid and detailed evidence and by capturing your reader's attention. Bar or line graphs describe and organize complex statistical data. Photographs can immediately convey abstract ideas. Maps can illustrate geography. Citing expert opinion. Although they are no substitute for careful reasoning of your own, the views of an expert can contribute to the force of your argument. When you rely on expert opinion, make sure your source is an expert in the field you are writing about. To help readers recognize the expert, provide credentials showing why your source is worth listening to. List the person's position or title alongside his or her name. When including expert testimony in your paper, you can summarize the expert's opinion or quote the expert's exact words. And that's known as a direct quote. Whenever you quote verbatim, that's a direct quote. Readers who already agree with you need no convincing, but skeptical readers may resist your arguments. To be willing to give up a position that seems reasonable, readers need to see that another position is even more reasonable. In addition to presenting your own case, therefore, you should consider the opposing arguments and attempt to counter them. It might seem at first that drawing attention to an opposing point of view or contradictory evidence would weaken your argument, but by anticipating and countering objections, you show yourself as a reasonable and well-informed writer. So to anticipate a possible objection to your argument, consider the following questions. Could a reasonable person draw a different conclusion from your facts or examples? Might a reader question any of your assumptions or offer an alternative explanation? Is there any evidence that might weaken your position? Can you concede the point to the opposition but challenge the point's importance or usefulness? Can you explain why readers should consider a new perspective? Should you explain how your position responds to contradictory evidence? When you write, use phrasing to signal to readers that you're about to present an objection. Often, the signal phrase can go in the lead sentence of a paragraph. Critics of this view argue that. Some writers might point out that. Researchers challenge these claims by. So these are good paragraph sentence starters for a counter-argument paragraph where you talk about what the other side thinks. And as you counter opposing arguments, try to seek out one or two assumptions you might share with readers who do not agree with your views. If you can show that you share their concerns, your readers will be more likely to accept your argument. So people believe that intelligence and decency support their side of an argument. To be persuaded, they must see qualities. In other words, when you write an argument, you need to find some common ground with your audience, and that will establish trust, because if the audience knows that you share the reader's values, then the reader is more likely to believe you. And here is an example of a statistics, how you can use statistics and graphs to show numerical data. If you have a lot of statistics and numbers, it's better to put it into a graph. Otherwise, you overwhelm the reader with too many numbers. And when you use statistics, just like when you have a counter-argument, paragraph, and you're able to rebut the other side, you strengthen your argument, and you make your argument look fair and representative and balanced. That's the word I was looking for. So here you have how to write an argumentative essay. So at this point, I will end this particular video, on the ethos, pathos, and logos of what constitutes a good argument. And in the next video, I will talk about how to write an argumentative essay. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me at any time.